Dimitri, anything you want to add to that? I mean, I'm just interested in Carl's comment that the Australian standard is not prescribed, but as he says, surely it's a good idea. And PCBUs have a duty of care. They're obliged to ensure the health and safety of not only their workers but others who are in their premises. You would say, wouldn't you, that compliance with the Australian standard is part of that duty of care?
Absolutely. From our perspective, the regulation actually prescribes the provision, or I suppose a duty, to provide information, instruction and training. There's the mandatory requirement for all PCBUs, for all businesses that have workers, that they need to, or they must provide information relating to the activity that they're undertaking. They must provide some instructions and they must provide some training. That's mandated. Now, in order to account for your obligations, there are codes of practice, and a specific code of practice relating to falls at workplaces is the Code of Practice Managing the Risk of Falls at Workplaces. This provides, I suppose, the minimum level of safety in terms of practical guidance for PCBUs. In this particular code, it makes a reference to the relevant Australian standards. So the relevant Australian standard for fall arrest systems is 1891, and obviously for industrial rope access there's 4488. So they're actually listed in this standard. So what that means is that those standards are, I suppose it's the expectation that they set the minimum level of safety, and you'd have to be aware of those standards. And if you look through those standards, I'm sure we'll talk about this, there are requirements and approaches to how you can comply with, or how you can demonstrate competency, because this is the critical issue that we've been raised here. How can someone demonstrate that a worker is competent? Well, you need to firstly provide them with the information and instructions. You have to deliver the training, and you really have to monitor their activities appropriately. So from our perspective, when we address compliance, we provide, as WorkCover, we provide this information, and we also ask questions relating to how businesses demonstrate their compliance with ultimately the Australian standards, because that's what is in the codes.
Thanks, Dimitri. I mean, that paints the picture of the self-regulation model and the guidance that's available. But I wanted to enlist Ken here just to talk about his experience, because there is obviously the regulatory environment, but also there's the lived experiences of people out there. And I was keen to get your perspective, Ken.
Yeah, we've had a couple of issues, well, quite a few issues with the installation of fall prevention equipment. One of the things that I might raise, and I don't want to stir you up, but even being compliant with the Australian standard doesn't necessarily mean it's safe, because the standard is just so loose. We had one instance where we had a fixed ladder and then a platform and then another fixed ladder up to a roof. The roof was about 6.5 metres, and just parts of the installation complied with the standard, but there's no thing in the standard about sharp protrusions into the field of the ladder and things like that. It's too general. So the people that installed it insisted that it complied. They were partially right, but it wasn't safe. So we had to sort of tear it down and replace it, basically. All our clients insist that we comply with Australian standards and things like that. So that part of it, making sure that it complies with the standard, is not a problem from that perspective, but actually making it safe, because the standard's so loose. And the certificates as well. Like, you've got guys, not that there's anything wrong with buying parts from China, but for example, where you've got a ladder, a fixed ladder, and they buy it from China and they cut it off at each end, it still complies with the standard because the rungs are equally spaced, but the space from the bottom rung to the floor and from the top rung to the platform can be any length at all, really. It doesn't specify that. So, you know, there's some serious issues there.
Peter, I mean, how did we get here? I mean, how is that possible, what Ken just described?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's one step that everybody seems to miss before we actually start talking about what we're doing wrong, and that is the hierarchy of control is embedded in our height safety regulations nationally, but I don't hear anybody talking about why aren't we following them. We're so busy talking about good anchor points or bad anchor points or ladders being put in incorrectly or whatever, we're forgetting that first step. And I, for one, have never seen any sign of a prosecution because somebody's actually doing the job incorrectly right back at design stage. Now, I recently retired, but I'm still doing a bit of consulting work, and I spend a lot of time working with some architects and some builders who want to get things right, and they'll go to great lengths to actually design a building to make it as safe as possible and to eliminate as much access as they can where they can't, to make it as safe as possible, and just follow that whole principle of hierarchy of control through. Now, just very briefly, for those that don't know what the hierarchy of control is, and I hope there's not too many, it's a very broad principle of if you can eliminate the need to work at height, then you can't fall off it, so it's very safe. If you can't do that, you go to a passive control, where somebody is safe, for example, by having a guardrail around them or a parapet around them. They're safe unless they choose to crawl over it and jump. So basically, they're safe no matter what they do. If you can't do that, you go to an active system, and even within that active system, there's another sub-hierarchy. And you'd start with a work positioning system, such as, there's a bit of debate here about where an EWP sits, but I believe it sits in work positioning. Rope access is work positioning. Restraint, if you can make it work properly, is work positioning. And if you can't do that, then you go to a fall arrest system where you actually accept that somebody could take a fall and then you'll rescue them from there. So that whole principle of hierarchy seems to be getting forgotten a lot, and I think it's important we kind of revisit that. Just very briefly too, and Michael, I bear no offence here to you, but the industry is driven by manufacturers for the most part. And I don't think that's a comment on the manufacturers. I think it's a comment on the industry that there's not enough other people at the top end of it who know their stuff but are not manufacturers. So we've got this kind of top-heavy arrangement where the manufacturers end up pushing their products and pushing... Everybody ends up thinking that they're the holders of all the knowledge, and they're not. They know a lot about their products, but quite often they don't even know a lot about how they should be installed correctly, particularly in cases where products come from overseas and they're simply passing them on to the user and trying to ensure they're used correctly. Our environment is quite different, say, to America or Canada, so they're issues that need to be looked at. We haven't produced, I know there's been talk about standards being too loose. I think we actually need more documentation, but I think we need to be producing some codes of practice, as the Rope Access Association have, ARAA. They've produced 3 documents on anchor points to try and actually demonstrate to the market what a competent installation looks like. And until we actually demonstrate what a competent installation looks like, no amount of training in the world is going to still get you a good outcome. You need to actually be able to say, here's your training, here's what you should be doing, now we've got some hope of getting it right. So I think that's a linkage that needs to be made. And the final one is we don't have decent control over who's entering the industry or what they're doing. It's already been said, so I won't labour that point too much. Oh, one more point, I'm sorry, Michael. The standards we've got at the moment aren't being followed. Ken alluded to it before, where there's a bit of looseness. I can give you 2 examples of 1891 series. One is anchors in tension. We just find that all the time. People simply don't read the standard and read very clearly what they can and can't do, and they just simply do the wrong thing. The other is fall distance, constantly putting anchor points in, compromising fall distance when it's not necessary. So, back to you.
Thanks for that, Peter. I mean, Dimitri, I'll bring you here in this context. There are a couple of issues that have been raised by Peter. One sensibly around the hierarchy of controls and design and the need to focus on design issues, and obviously that's been an area of focus in terms of the communication of the regulators across the board for some time. The second aspect that Peter mentioned seems to be, well, if that's the case, why isn't that backed up with regulatory action? I'll get you to comment on those things. Perhaps even pick up that thread around the guidance material, because obviously the suggestion was the industry needs to take the lead in relation to further guidance material, but there's clearly a role here for regulators to do the same, and have done to some extent, but given what Ken has described, perhaps that's not working as it should.
All right. Well, firstly, the issue or the focus on design. I suppose designers' obligations relating to design of buildings and structures is a new regulatory requirement for New South Wales. Being new, it's part of the. It came into force in 2011, we haven't had a chance to, I suppose, test the provisions of that, or actually proceed through, I suppose, a prosecution, because these things ultimately get determined through the courts. But saying that, we recognise that there's a need to assist those designers of buildings and structures with some practical guidance, and we are, I suppose, consulting with relevant industry stakeholders to develop some practical guidance relating to their obligations as designers. So we are actively involved in doing that, such as to assist industry, and we, as part of we're not just there to, I suppose, enforce the requirements, we're there to provide assistance and advice. So we constantly, when inspectors go on site, obviously when they see or they observe an unsafe practice, they usually would stop the activity and provide some directions. But at the same time, we've got the equally important aspect of providing advice and assistance to industry. So on that issue about design, just to sum up, we've definitely got some plans to release some guidance aimed at designers. Now, the other issue about the why the regulators haven't proceeded with this, I suppose it's definitely, we've acknowledged that it's an industry issue relating to falls. In terms of the plant itself, whether that's fixed ladders or fall arrest systems, we are still, because it's new legislation, we haven't gone down that track to actually establish the framework where we can, apply our regulatory powers. So that's.
Yeah, no, it's a fair comment. I mean, one of the things that people don't appreciate is it takes some time for a prosecution to see its way through the courts, and we certainly, the legislation came in New South Wales 1 January 2012. So you'd expect that the first lot of prosecutions would work themselves through the courts over the next 6 months.